I'd like to introduce someone to you who believes this conference is made just for him. This is Edward Key. He's of Woomera Rocket Research of Laverne, California. He wants to try to get payloads into low Earth orbit at the rate of $22 a pound. He insists he is not a crackpot. He's had 5 years of launch site experience with Vancouver, California, and he was an engineer at Aerojet. Most recently, he worked with Rockwell International, and he authored the paper, among others, Low-Cost Space Transportation, the search for the lowest cost. I'd like to introduce you, Edward Key.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for all being here. Over here is the beginning of my search a long time ago. This is 1986 in Moscow, USSR. And I had an opportunity to see a different overview of space than a lot of you did. I used to work in Woomera, Australia. And over there we had the opportunity to do the early warning mission for the United States, including watching space launches from the Soviet Union. And I was very much impressed by the fact they were able to put up 90 to 100 space missions per month. That's 2 a week on average. And they were able to use a lot of very large rockets, including the one that used these engines. There was a rocket that used, I count there, 4 engines in that cluster. This thing lifted off with 20 main engines and 12 vernier engines burning. Now that's about 1,100 main engines per year they're producing. Here in the United States, we don't have a rocket program where we produce 12 booster engines in any one year. At this time, we haven't for a long time. How can they do it? And so that was some of the early search I did on trying to identify how can we bring the cost down from our present costs of anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000 a pound, typically. And I've got 1 hour basically. I think one of the biggest things I have to do is prove that we're not insane about this. We really can do it, and we know what we're doing. As I was going through some of these trade studies and kept finding that there are ways of bringing the cost down lower and lower, it came clear that these are such low costs, people are going to either think I'm crazy or don't know what we're doing. And I was able to finally see that knew what I was doing, so they're going to think the opposite. So I have to show that I'm not crazy also. We'll show that there's no technological breakthroughs are required, and we found that the key to making rockets inexpensive is to manufacture them in a commercial manner, commercial grade, very robust, not in a clean room, but in the sort of manufacturing situation you'd see for making cars or washing machines. And this isn't really too far off. I had a friend who went to the Soviet Union and saw where they manufacture the RD-170 engines for the Zenit. And when they're not building rocket engines on that assembly line, they reconfigure it and they build washing machines. And this is the sort of thing that I was looking to. Next slide. And the real advantage of making things in a commercial manner is the cost, at least on a per pound basis, even though they will weigh a little bit more than a space grade, you're talking about something that costs 100 to 1,000 times per pound less than what will be built by Aerojet, Rockwell, or some of these big aerospace companies. They also, you'd expect to build them in larger quantities. Now, rockets are seemingly very elegant and difficult to manufacture. In fact, if they look like this, how are you going to really make it in a commercial environment? Well, one of the big things that we have to do is to simplify to a large extent so that rockets don't look like this. They're not extremely elegant machinery. And that's one of the problems we seem to have so far is that American-built spacecraft and rockets tend to be custom-made machinery. We're building these things by ones and twos, very small quantities. They're built like a custom-made watch, not like a mass-produced piece of machinery. And it also requires great care, very tight tolerances, and they work very hard on keeping performance up and mass down. Next slide. So, at first we attacked simplification as being part of the problem that we could overcome. And we found that overcoming complexity went part of the way. But it wasn't really the whole answer, because we found so many examples of American-built spacecraft that are extremely expensive, and yet they're very simple. For example, a lightweight, basically 11-gallon propellant tank that goes into a spacecraft with no moving parts can cost $500,000. It's very light, but that's a pretty expensive part for no moving part. Now these are the surface tension propellant tanks that allow any propellant that's floating around to work its way in, so you have no gaps or no air, no gas inside this thing. They have a very important purpose, but that's a very expensive price tag. Another example is this device over here, where I work with Rockwell. They actually use this as an example of something that's perhaps too complex. Actually, it's made out of ordinary parts. Those are washers, springs, screws, and all it is a payload bay door switch. Has only 4 active components, 4 little micro switches over here that close or open to tell whether or not the payload bay door is actually closed. That's the levers. There's not really much to it. If you looked at it, this hardware all looks like things you'd find in the corner hardware store, and it's about this size. But the parts alone that the government pays for is $10,528. Now that's the sort of thing we're trying to attack and get rid of. Now, going to the Soviet Union, we found that it's not a country where things run very well. It seems like you have to stand in 2 lines to buy something, one line to pay for the item and one line to pick it up. Things just don't run well there at all, but there's an exception. Their space program seems to run very well for a system that doesn't work. For something like 22 years, they were averaging 90 to 100 launches per year, and at one single type, their SL-4 vehicle, which is the one I referred to, that had 32 engines going when it lifts off, they averaged more than 1 per week. And they did it heavily with modularity. They had few designs and many copies, and it came clear that the main difference between the American space program as we now know it and the Soviet space program was they were a manufacturing-oriented space program, whereas we're an engineering-oriented space program. They build large numbers of things, we build small numbers. It's just kind of the opposite of the different of how we are in our commercial world. The Soviets have a very inefficient commercial world. We have a very efficient commercial world. In the aerospace industry, they worked out to be very efficient with the resources they do have. And this is a cutaway of their main engines on their SL-4. And if you look at compared to American-made engines, it's really quite simple. There's no steering on the main engines. No steering whatsoever. They use vertical engines that aren't swiveled in 2 degrees of freedom. They just swivel back in one they just swivel back and forth, and that gives you all the steering you need. There's a lot less complexity in that. I don't want to go into the details that a lot of rocket engineers would look at that and see. But that is more of the goal of the kind of engine I would like to see built. Next slide. And then another major, I guess I'll call it discovery from my point of view, at least what I found, was that if you have something like this, this is the SL-4 I was talking about, looking at the back end of it, as you notice, it has 20 main engines. It has 2 vernier engines on the outside of each one of these boosters, 4 on the outside of the central core. That's a lot of engines. They're getting economies of scales by building large numbers of the same part over and over again. Economies of scale is not building large pieces. Economies of scale is building large numbers of something. It's very interesting that learning curves is another thing that they progress further down. Suppose they have a weakness in one of these engines, and they have 20 of them. And this weakness will cause one failure every 20 to 40 missions. They're going to discover that on the first or second mission. We're going to wait till our 20th or our 40th mission before we discover it. They ring out problems much earlier with this sort of a system. That's part of the learning curve. As they manufacture them in large numbers, they bring down the cost because they learn how to make them better. If you have to build 1,100 engines like these each year, you're going to have to figure out some way of manufacturing in large numbers and keeping your quality up. That's going to really exercise your brain power. And I mentioned fast ringing out of the failures. And they have very high production rates on this. Look at their experience. These 4 boosters are identical, so every time that they fly, they get 4 times the experience on their boosters. And these things hardly ever fail. I've looked at some publications which indicate that you can expect one of these rockets, which by the way has carried every cosmonaut that's ever gone to space. You can now expect to see about 1 failure in every 300 launches. There's nothing like that in America. The Russians have very high early failure rate, but because of the reuse over and over again, wringing things out early, they've managed to have very high success rates on their booster systems as they've gotten the experience they have as this one, which has had 1,400 plus launches, successful launches. So I'd like to go over the whole process of where we came to come up with our design. First thing is we formulate a workable strategy, kind of given all the tools at that point, and go right into a sensible and forgiving architecture. By sensible and forgiving architecture, let me give you just a little example. Take the single stage to orbit. Now it's a good concept. I like all these rival concepts, and they should be practiced out. But however, if you add an extra pound to the single stage to orbit, you take a pound off the payload. Comparing this thing, the rocket that I'll present, side by side, a single stage to orbit type vehicle capable of carrying the same payload mine would weigh about the same gross liftoff weight, approximately the same amount of dry weight, approximately the same amount of propellant. But the single stage to orbit has to have 1.6 times the specific impulse, that is the amount of energy you get from the engines, and has to have 4 times the propellant volume that my design would have. And so these are all major advantages if you're looking to build something that is very economic. We have to explore all the ways of getting into space at lower cost. We can't say focus just on one. But I've tried to do trade studies that will come up with what is the lowest cost approach to making it into space. From sensible and forgiving architecture came over, and we need to have clusters of things. Whatever we do, we want to have something that has large amount of reuse in the design over and over again, and something that will make it so that when we build even a few of these vehicles, we're already well on to mass production. That's what really brings the cost down. Not making things custom, but making them in a commercial manner. And you can't make things in a commercial manner, onesies and twosies or 3 at a time. The goal would be to build something that has a low first article cost that would be able to drive it down. And to get there, we found that simplification was very important. And then if we want to get down to commercial grade, we also have to have more forgiving margins. We can't build things to very high tolerance. We can't build things that if you drop a wrench on it, you're going to have a tiger team brought in to investigate it and determine whether it's flyable or not. You have to make it so you can pack these things up, not in special canisters, but in cardboard boxes. We want to also make it so that we can use off-the-shelf commercial items. There are quite a few off-the-shelf items that perhaps can be useful on a commercial grade rocket. For example, GPS receivers, computer, IBM, PC cards, for example, may be very useful in it. And then we come down to if we are able to get to the commercial grade and we're building things in large numbers, the learning curve effects, and as the higher our production rate, the faster we drive the cost down, is additive with economies of scale, building a plant that will build these things in large numbers at very low cost, which means not very many employees in the plant, which will bring us down to low cost, and that feeds back, by the way, of course, through increased demand because the cost is lower, to increasing the numbers. But we also will have to, and this will be I'll be having another conference that we're going to where we'll show that with the increased demand, we have to also come up with new applications. because if we do things exactly the way we are doing now, there is only a limited amount of people who want to go to orbit. But if we bring the cost way down, we're going to have a lot of new applications available, and I think it's important to lead the way on that one too. Okay, next slide. This is what the rocket looks like, by the way. Give a little description of it. This is a 4-stage rocket made of 7 almost identical clusters. You can see one hidden back here. And inside the core is basically, it's the same as these outer ones. Large numbers of engines on the bottom. The configuration I have now requires 73 nearly identical engines. There are actually 2 configurations, differing primarily on the expansion ratio. One is for the low expansion ratio for lifting off, and the other one is a variable expansion ratio. But 73 engines down here. They're fairly large engines because these are something that nobody has ever done before. These are low pressure engines, and there are no turbo pumps in here. This is completely pressure fed engine, so you're eliminating right off the bat huge amounts of the most expensive machinery that's in a rocket. The cost of rockets are driven by the turbo pumps drive the cost of engines drive the cost of rocket vehicles, and rocket vehicles is the underlying cost driver for all our space program costs. Everything has to rise to be in balance with the economics. If you're going to spend $50 million for a rocket, you're not going to put a cheap cargo on top of this thing. So you're going to have a very expensive payload. So that becomes a cost driver. This thing is about 40 feet high from here to here. This would be a payload section up here. So the basic rocket is 40 feet high, 8 feet in diameter. It weighs about 720,000 pounds gross liftoff weight. It's a very small one. In fact, you can almost service it with a ladder. One other thing, this thing, when it lifts off, all the engines are running in parallel, so you get maximum use of the engines. But you're only drawing propellant from 2 tanks at a time. For example, that tank and that tank are supplying all the engines as you lift off until you get to the end of first stage. And those 2 drop off with the engines and the empty tanks. And the other 5 sections are now full of propellant, second stage, and they continue on until the next 2 tanks are completely empty of propellant, and then they drop off, leaving a cluster of 3 complete filled with fuel. That's third stage. And when those are finally empty, you have a center core, which is full of propellant, and that's fourth stage. Okay. And the reason we want to have pressure-fed engines is because it's extremely simple if you can get away with it. There's no gas generators, no high-speed turbines. I mean, the turbines in a space shuttle main engine develop something like 100,000 pounds, 100,000 horsepower to pump huge quantities of propellant. We want to get completely away from that. These high-density pumps are probably the most difficult thing to manufacture in a rocket. No constantly moving parts. We want the simplicity of a solid rocket motor, yet the cooling capacity and the low cost of liquid propellant. And the liquid propellant we chose is kerosene and liquid oxygen, which comes out to about 7 cents a pound, which is about as low as you can get a propellant. And yet it works very good. It has good impulse density. The bottom line is that pressure-fed engines have the potential to be manufactured at very low cost with relatively little sacrifice in performance. In fact, we've worked on some innovations that make it so that these engines operating at 385 psi have approximately the same performance characteristics as the H1 engine that was used on the Saturn 1B or the Atlas MA5 engine set. And we're looking to build these engines. We're talking about 73 engines. What sort of price? These engines wouldn't have any moving parts. These would have excluding the valves, which are not actually a part of the engine, for approximately $400 an engine. Ship it out in a cardboard box. This is the sort of prices we're talking about getting down to. And it means you're not going to have a very large factory to build these engines, but you will build them in large commercial grade quantities. I'm not sure whether people are really overly interested in the technical aspect of this, but Altitude compensating nozzles is one of the key technologies, and in the paper I wrote, it outlines 10 key technologies that are very important of making this thing come through at the costs we're talking about and with the performance we're talking about. Altitude compensating nozzles are simply based on the fact that on a rocket engine, when you expand the gases, if the exit pressure is the same as the ambient pressure, you're very optimum. If you overexpand it to the point where when the gases are leaving the nozzle, it's far lower pressure than the outside air, then you've got a large negative pressure thrust component, and it really cuts down the performance. And this is worse at low pressure engines than it is at high pressure engines. And so what we've done is came up with a scheme of taking a high altitude optimized engine and putting a liner in here that will blade away. And so when it lifts off, it's optimum for sea level conditions. As it burns slowly away, as it rises in altitude, it will constantly be growing in exit area, so you have a very optimum performance at very low cost. And you're not going to pay the penalty or have to make the trade-offs of having low altitude optimized engines mixed with high altitude optimized engines. That's a major technology improvement. There are some problems with this sort of thing, but we've worked very hard on making it so the problems actually help some other solutions we were looking for. Now the advantages are too, if you have something like this, you don't have to have stiffeners on the nozzle. You've got a lot of the area of the nozzle, the exit part, that's covered for part of the time, so you do lower the nozzle cooling over part of the flight, and you eliminate moving parts by other altitude compensating nozzle schemes. No mechanically moving parts in this. Tanks and pressurization is a subject that is probably the most difficult part in the solutions that we found. I'm going to kind of skip over it because it sounds like it's real easy. You just pressurize the tank and there it is. There is a lot of complexity, but I think I'd prefer to cover that in the paper instead of Another important innovation we're looking for in this rocket design is steering without a rudder, as I call it. If we can eliminate the hydraulic system, all the hydraulic actuators, the gimbals, and all the flex connections, we've reached a major simplification. A major simplification also means not only major cost savings, but much less dry mass. We make this thing lighter and cheaper if we don't have to steer with some sort of a thrust vector control. And we can also eliminate failure modes. Very important. There's quite a few of the failures in American rockets has been with the thrust vector control systems. And it also eliminates problems of steering with the altitude compensating nozzles we talked about, because an altitude compensating nozzle that I have shown you changes in mass as the mission progresses. It becomes lighter and lighter. It also converts a hardware mechanical problem into a software electronic problem, kind of like analogous to going from a mechanical watch, which is expensive and one function, building a digital watch, which is cheap and multifunction. And here's how it works. With pressure-fed rockets, unlike turbopump-fed rockets, you can have very fast response time on throttling these things up and down. You can almost throttle a pressure-fed rocket just by squeezing the pipe. And so all you have to do, unlike the traditional thrust vector control, in which you're changing the direction of the thrust vector, you're merely throttling up one side and down the other side in order to keep it in balance. You're steering with the difference in thrust of all these 73 engines. Next slide. Okay, I just want to say some people call this a cheap rocket. I don't really like the word cheap. I think it kind of implies that it's tinny, it's going to break easy, where that's exactly the opposite. We're trying to build something that's very, very robust. The mass figures that we have in our paper will show that it's a very heavy and robust system, yet it still gets the payload up there. It does it by the elegance of the architecture rather than the elegance of the machinery. Okay, next. And these performance charts I'm going to go over fairly quickly. These are as an obligation to put these up if you're making a presentation to NASA, because it shows that you run this through a computer program and see how the performance will be, and you've done all your trade studies and so forth. This time, thrust versus time. As you can see, we start with a liftoff thrust of about 1.3 billion pounds. We have a lot of thrust in the first stage, and altitude versus time. And the only thing, as our current design is, we're going to do a little redesigning to cut off the peaks of our G-forces. And that won't affect the performance the way we're going to do it. In fact, we'll be enhancing it because we will be operating in the fourth stage at a lower pressure than the 385 psi for the engines. We're going to run those at a lower pressure, and that will stretch out the time, but keep the flight loads down. And by the fact that we started with such high Gs, this thing lifts off at about 1.8 Gs versus about 1.2 for a standard rocket vehicle. We very quickly go up the dynamic pressure curve, but at about 34 seconds into the flight, we have first stage, and we have a huge saddle bucket, and so we never really reach very high dynamic pressures. The Q is fairly low. We'll go over these two very quickly. This performance of velocity versus time and altitude versus downrange, just to show we went through all these trade studies. Now this is back into the scale. That's a person. As you can see, it's not a very large rocket, and that's part of what we want. We want something that's small enough that we're going to have very low capital launch facilities. Something that can almost be a mobile launch site. And we found that as we made these presentations, there's a lot of people who doubted it could be done. But I'd like to use some analogies. There's resistance to change and reluctance to accepting new concepts. But the same thing was true for sewing machines. People were also afraid because that could threaten their job. A sewing machine was a device that one sewing machine did the work of 40 tailors. And so the tailors all thought, we're going to be out of a job if the sewing machine really catches on. Well, it wasn't true. We had a garment industry. There was more demand for tailors than ever before. Cotton gin. Now there was a case where it was presumed that this is going to cut down the amount of slaves that's required to take these seeds out of the cotton. We won't need as many slaves. It will actually kill slavery. Instead, cotton became king because cotton went down in price. Demand shot way up. Demand could hardly be satisfied with the prices they had. And huge growth in the plantation system. And so it didn't, what occurred was not what people thought at the time. The personal computer. There was a time probably if you said that in 1965 that someday in 20 years you'll be able to have a $1,000 computer that will sit on your desk and it will have the power of the biggest computer we have today. They'd say, well, sell your IBM stock because with those low prices, we'll not make any money. But it's become a mass industry. And that's what we'd like to see happen to space, is turn space from what I've unfortunately called a hobby shop from time to time, to a mass industry. And hopefully, we'll have low-cost space transportation. And then there's the question of why hasn't anybody ever thought of this before? Actually, everything I've proposed up here and putting it together has been the result of trade studies, but I have not included anything in it that has not been proposed someplace else before, or especially tried before. Almost everything is, you can find someplace where it has been done before. I relied heavily on analyzing the Soviet systems and big dumb booster systems. But I believe that we can do much better than either of those independently if we combine all the strengths of American manufacturing capabilities, Soviet modularity, and big dumb booster simplicity. Then we can go ahead and come up with a real low-cost system. The idea of building rockets in large numbers is not new. The Germans built about 6,572 V2 rockets, mostly in the last 6 months of World War II. That's mass production. They were turning them out at the rate of 30 per day. These were built underground in conditions of high bombing in an economy that was slowly collapsing. and built by people who were motivated to stay alive. They were slave laborers. They were not people who were high technology. So it has been done before that you make things that are very robust, work very well, build them in large numbers. Unfortunately, that's a terrible example of where it came from. But in a free society, we should do a lot better than that. The Soviets have over 1,400 space missions with their SL-4 family from 1957 to 1990, which means that they've manufactured 28,000 main engines, 7,000 turbo pumps, and 17,000 Vertier engines. And those strap-on boosters inside made 5,600 of them. That's large numbers. There's nothing in the American space experience to compare with numbers like that. And my feeling is that it's time that we go ahead and try to come up with a Model T type of space vehicle, something that can get you safely to orbit at very low cost. And the launch part of a space program should be just the end of the factory. I would envision where you're assembling these things in a factory and they roll out on vertical on railroad tracks out to a launch site, and you launch them the very same day you finish manufacturing them if necessary, or you perhaps you store them. But nonetheless, the time that you put a payload on it and roll it out, to fuel it and send it out, it shouldn't spend any more than an 8-hour shift to get this thing from the shed to liftoff. Now, if we're going to come up with a very low-cost space transportation, something that's targeted for $22 a pound, I think it's kind of folly to spend billions of dollars on it. You should use the same techniques of bringing the cost down of the development cycle that you do for the manufacturing cycle. If you don't, all you're doing is throwing money away. There should be a close balance. So we've looked at ways of doing that, particularly modularity is a very important part of it. And we have a vehicle that's made of 7 nearly identical segments, very robust margins, bringing up failure modes early with flight experience, and a consistency of philosophy between the mission cost and the target development cost. Now, if we had right now the ability to put things into orbit, we're looking at talking about the rocket that I was showing you was designed for 15,000 pounds of payload. What would we do with it? I don't think the customers are suddenly going to come up and say, put my product on. We have a space system that's designed only for the most expensive payloads and in very small numbers. So we think that we have to propose ways of using this if we met our cost targets. And the ones that I think are most important, things like space station supply logistics. I think one of the greatest wastes of resources is use a space shuttle to carry TV dinners into space. Take this up with the space shuttle. This, which is not a meal for a guy my size, it's about $14,500. And if you transship this thing to the moon or Mars, it'll be over $100,000 for one person's meal. And he's going to have at least 3 meals a day. And we're not talking about all the supplies he's going to breathe. See, there's something like this. Toothpaste for 1 day, $75 or $80. We're not going to have an active space station or lunar or Mars program if we're paying costs like that for ordinary supplies. These are things that are cheap on Earth, but very expensive in space. Next slide. And in fact, I'm very concerned by the fact that we've kind of gone backwards in the way we've done things. Back in the early 1960s and into the 70s, we had huge numbers of space ventures. 61 were called Explorer. They weren't all alike. There were many different kinds of spacecraft, but huge numbers. We got into the 1970s, and we're sending them out 2 at a time. 2 Vikings, a primary and a backup, both of which were successful. 2 Voyagers, a primary and a backup, both successful. We come into the 1990s, we assume they'll all be successful. We only have 1 of each, 1 Mars observer, 1 Hubble telescope. And there's much less variety than there were earlier. So this is a trend that I would like to see reversed. Next slide. Leading into this, this will be the subject of a conference in Colorado in 10 days. I'll make a presentation. is one major item that should go on low-cost space transportation would be a propulsion module, something capable of pushing another spacecraft anywhere in the solar system you want. Something like this. This is a Delta upper stage, weighs less than 15,000 pounds. If you could get those to be rendezvoused in space and cluster them together or stack them in a row like a train, you can push any payload to any destination at very low cost, especially if you use the same techniques of low-cost space transportation on a low-cost propulsion module. If you wanted to take a Mars Observer class payload and send it to Pluto, you'd take probably about 28 of these would get you there, to get you into Pluto orbit. Now, if these are $50 million a piece, it'll never happen. But if the cost is $1 or $2 million a piece, you might have an opportunity to have some fantastic exploration of the solar system. These are also useful for taking things to a place like geostationary orbit and so forth. This is a product that I think there's so much demand for propulsion. 3/4 of all the mass that the United States ever sent to space has been propulsion or propellants. That's a mass market. Next. Another mass market that we see is a universal cargo carrier. Similar, this is a Soviet Soyuz. It doesn't look very elegant. In fact, it always reminds me of a high school welding class attempt to build a diving bell. It really looks ugly. But the Russians have built these by the hundreds. And if it's not a Soyuz with a man in that cabin, and who goes between these two cabins, this one re-enters, this is another, and this is your propulsion back here. If they want to send supplies up, they have a capsule that's almost the same as that. It's called a Progress, and it carries up 2,300 kilograms, 2.3 metric tons of supplies to their Mir space station. If they want to spy on us, they put cameras in the windows, and they call it a medium resolution imaging reconnaissance satellite. They were putting up capsules that were variants of this at the rate of close to 50 per year for 20 years. Now, I think that we can go a long ways towards building something like that, not only to supply things like the space station. As I said, we don't want to put TV dinners in the space shuttle. But also, if you have a commercial venture, we would like to be able to ship you a capsule like this. You put your experiment into it. If you want it secret, you seal it. You ship it back to our launch site. We set it up. It comes back. The upper capsule gets recovered. We send it back to you, and you pull out your crystals or whatever it is they've grown in total industrial secrecy. If CNN wants to monitor something or wants to have a communication satellite of their own, put it in here not with aerospace grade electronics, but with commercial grade electronics. And then there's the small satellite market. This is our big one. We call it a boomer rocket, 40 feet high from here to here, as we've shown to you. We looked into the possibility of making a smaller one, 20 feet high, 4 feet diameter, capable of about 1,500 pounds capacity to low Earth orbit, and that would also prove out all our concepts. And the application would be, for example, the Iridium. It's a concept of putting 77 satellites into orbit by Motorola and Lockheed. This is the first time that there's an American space program, which is commercial, by the way, that contemplates mass market. Competition with it is 48 Loral Global Star communication satellites. These satellites would allow anybody in the world to telephone anybody else. And I don't think that reusability is mature at that time. And when it finally does, I'm sure that these concepts will be economically obsolete. But until they are, I think that what we have to do is drive the cost of our rockets down primarily by driving down the manufacturing cost. And we think that we could start off at a price around there and work the way down there. Now, this is the cost. I should say cost. Price naturally would be a lot higher because we're in this to make money. For example, I'm sure that a Iridium satellite, if you paid $100,000 for the launch as a company, you could probably sell that service to Motorola for about $2.5 million if you threw in all the insurance and they would find it very much lower price than they'll find anywhere else, and we would have a very high profit margin. Okay. Well, what are we right now? This is the Warmer Rocket Research Institute. I was working for Rockwell International, and my last day on the payroll is end of shift Monday. So I do have a business plan under organization, and I'm looking for, as an embryo company, looking for some sort of backing that will get the venture capital to explore this to a larger degree. And some of you may have contacts with venture capitalists or people who have an interest or people who can get the backing or people who can make things happen. And I would like to talk to you about that during our breaks. And mainly we'd like to say we think that even though there's a lot of rocket companies out there and we're just very immature, that there is a niche for us. Thank you very much. Oh, there's two more days. This is just the way we're looking at. From our initial research, we assume that our large rocket would have to be a government operation, and our small one would be strictly a commercial operation, the parallel development of both of them. And I would like very much to talk to you, people privately afterwards, but now on the question and answer.
We need to wrap it up. It's
Okay. Thank you very much.